everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you guys back to this new weekly Torah video here on the channel of Jóvenes Peregrinando. In today's video, we're going to be analyzing chapters 21 and 22 of Leviticus, and today's video is titled A Consecrated and Suitable Service Before the Eternal. Before we begin with today's topic, first let's remember what we learned last week. In chapter 19, we saw that the Eternal instructs the people of Israel regarding to the pagan practices that the nations would do, which was something that the people of Israel were prohibited to do, since let's remember that they represented an impurity not only for the people who would practice these practices, but also for the Mishkan, where the divine presence would be. We also learned about the laws of Hukim, which have no explanation and are often misunderstood by humans. However, they teach us important principles to consider in our days. Lastly, in chapter 20, we learned that it mentions about the consequences regarding to the practices that the nations would do. That way, these would be as an example for the people of Israel to not fall into these actions. Nowadays, although these consequences that we read in chapter 20 are not in a literal way anymore, however, it is an opportunity for us to do the right thing in our pilgrimage before the coming of the Messiah on this earth to come judge all the souls. In today's chapters, we're going to be learning about the holiness of the people of Israel, since they were called to seek it. But even more, this holiness that we're going to be talking about had to be presented in the lives of the Levites, who could not live or do the same things that the common Israelites would normally do, and even so the greater minister, who had a greater responsibility that required more consecration than any other Israelite. And we will also be seeing that we will also see this holiness through these laws that the Creator instructed for a suitable service, both for the people or for the person who carried out their service, as well as his service should be according to what was established by the Creator. With this short introduction, let's now begin reading verses 1 to 4 of chapter 21 of Leviticus, where we're going to be seeing that it talks about the consecration of the Levites in the aspect of life. It says, "The Eternal said to Moses, 'Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, no one shall make himself unclean for the dead among his people, except for his closest relatives and his mother, his father, his sons, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister, who is near to him, because she has had no husband. For her, he may make himself unclean. He shall not make himself unclean as a husband among his people, and so profane himself.'" In these verses, we can read that if the minister lost a close relative to him, then he was able to go bury that person. But if the person that had died or that had passed away was not a close relative to him, then he couldn't go to bury him or her, because he was only going to be contaminated with the impurities that the people or that the body had. This issue of death is something that we all inevitably face, since we are mortal, and although in the beginning it really wasn't like that, but because of the sin, this came as a consequence for us. And for this reason, it is why death can be seen as something that is part of life. In this case, of the ministers. They were prohibited from all kinds of contact with a dead body, because the moment a person dies, the body starts to enter a state of decomposition, which brings with it physical contamination for any person. The Levites should avoid exposing themselves to the contamination that the body of the dead person brought, since it not only represented physical contamination but also ceremonially in the Mishkan, the place where they ministered. And if by any reason they were contaminated, then they could not minister there in the Mishkan for 7 days. And this we can verify it in number 16 verse 11. Another thing that we can see with this topic is the difference between the priests of the Eternal who consecrated themselves, keeping these laws of the Creator, or versus the priests of the nations who prepared the corpse of death for their rituals, as well as for their ceremonies and their other pagan practices. In this, we can see that firmness that the Levites had, and it is something that we must also have as believers of the same faith of Yeshua, knowing that we have been called to be faithful servants of the Creator at all times and keep ourselves consecrated and pure before Him. And although we live in this contaminated world, however, we must be like those priests of the Eternal who did not assimilate with the practices of the nations, but rather they kept themselves consecrated and apart from the nations, and became obedient to the Eternal. From verses 5 to 6, it says that the Levites should not only avoid contaminating or being contaminated by a dead person or a dead body, but also not to imitate practices dedicated to the dead of other nations. These consisted mainly of shaving or cutting parts of the body, such as the head and beard of the men. Within its context, the ministers were prohibited from shaving their heads, since that was consecrated, but it also applied to the people who made a vow to the Creator among the Israelites. It could be said that the reason why the people of Israel were forbidden, or actually in this case the Levites were forbidden to cut their hair, was because the priests of Babylon were represented in the temples with their robes torn, also with their hair and beards shaved, as well with their heads uncovered. There were also other types of customs or practices that the priests of other nations did in their pagan temples. The purpose of all of this that the Creator put as instructions for the Levites was to make a difference between the nations and His people. This theme currently continues to teach us the same principle of not assimilating to the world, because as young people we can often seek to be accepted by the world. It's something that awakens in us that we want to be part of a certain group. We want to be seen by certain people. We want to be recognized. We want to have all of this intention. And although we should no longer do this act in a literal way, however, we can rather refer this to our thoughts and words that are covered under the covering of the Messiah and His instruction. that could not be done on the Levites was cut their skin, since apparently this had to do with a literal cut. For example, in 1 Kings 18:28, we can read that the prophets of Baal cut themselves according to their custom with knives and lancets, and this was until their hand would drip with blood. For this reason, it is that the Eternal forbidden the people of Israel to do these types of pagan acts that the other nations would do. In verse 6, we can see that the position of the Levites within the people required holiness. They were intermediaries between the Creator and the people of Israel. Therefore, they had to give a good testimony so as not to profane the name of the Creator. Continuing with verses 7-9, it says, "They shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who has been defiled, neither shall they marry a woman divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his Eternal. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your Eternal. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Eternal, who sanctify you, am holy. And the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by whoring, profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire." In these verses, we can see this importance of the consecration and the union of the Levites. Saving oneself for the union was something really important for the people of Israel, but specifically for the Levites, since it was an instruction addressed to the ministers so that they would not interfere with their service within the Mishkan. On the other hand, we can also read that the scripture mentions the case of adultery and divorce, because if a person who was in this situation, this verse says that if a person was in these sort of situations, then that person no longer was, or it was not recommended for that person to be in a union once again. The most advisable thing for him or her was not to rejoin or not to remarry or to marry someone again. This issue of consecration until reaching the union is something that in today's youth, they don't really give it so much importance to it anymore, because many times we come to believe that we are all owners of our lives and we do not want to do anything, or we do not want anyone to interfere in our lives, much less when it comes to choosing our spouse. However, in these verses, we can see that it is really not like that. As most of us know, the life of the human being belongs to the Creator, to whom we owe obedience and consecration all the time, even in the union. Because today it has come to believe that the union can be done when we want, with whoever we want, wherever we want. And we believe that it is done, or it's actually believed that it is done in a safe and responsible way. This thought has caused people to go against of what the Creator put as a commandment for humanity. But now, as believers, we must ignore those thoughts and understand that the Creator put this commandment for the good of us. And as young people living in a perverse generation, even so, we must remain firm and try to keep, or make sure to keep, ourselves safe until we reach the union with the correct person, who must be an obedient person of the Eternal. He or she must be fully delivered to the eternal service in the correct way and be faithful servants of the Eternal, who gave their or who obeys the instructions of the Creator. Finally, in verse 9, we can read that the holiness required for a priest was that he should be present in his house and with his family. In this case, it's talking about the daughter who, despite having a priest as her father, if she anyhow got to profane herself, then she would be held responsible for her actions, and in this way she was, or the consequence for these actions was that she was going to be burned in fire. Continuing with verses 10 to 15, it says, "The priest who is chief among his brothers, whose head the anointing oil is poured, and who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose nor tear his clothes. He shall not go into any dead bodies, nor make himself unclean, even for his father or for his mother. He shall not go out of the sanctuary, lest he profane the sanctuary of his Elohim. For the consecration of the anointing oil of his Elohim is on him. I am the Eternal. And he shall take a wife in her virginity, a widow or a divorced woman, or a woman who has been defiled, or a prostitute. These he shall not marry, but he shall take as his wife a virgin of his own people, and he may not profane his offspring among his people, for I am the Eternal who sanctifies them." In these verses, we can read that the great minister was not allowed to be contaminated for any reason, not even by his parents when they died, much less by any other relatives. An example that we can see in the scriptures, specifically in this book of Leviticus, is in this case or in this story of Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, who, being the grand minister Aaron, he was forbidden to express any mourning for his own children. These instructions that are given in these verses can be seen as very strict for a person, but it was because the position held by the great minister required a greater consecration than the other Levites and then the rest of the people of Israel. Because let's remember that he was the only one who entered the Holy of Holies, or of the most holy places, and therefore he couldn't be profaned and with these types of contaminations that would come from dead bodies. And also read in these verses that he was only able to get married to a virgin woman in order to not profane his offspring, which had to be consecrated to the Eternal for conception, since they would inherit the responsibility within the Mishkan. This instruction is fulfilled in the Messiah Yeshua, who was born of a virgin, or out of a virgin woman named Miriam, who is a relative of Elizabeth, wife of a priest, and for this reason it is believed that she, Miriam, belonged to the priestly lineage of Levi, to whom these instructions were given in these verses. From verses 16 to 24, we can read that that it speaks of the impediments to pursue the service. The first thing that we can see in these verses is that those who ministered had to be perfect regardless of the cause of the defects that are described in these verses, whether they were born in that way or it was caused by an illness or by an accident that they had in their lives. And these defects could not be in these people who ministered, being them or being they a shadow of the Messiah, the great minister and the perfect Korban, whom we must imitate. In Matthew 5:48, it tells us to be perfect as our Elohim is perfect. This does not refer to a literal perfection, as many will nowadays see it and have always seen it as something in like something that we simply just can't be perfect. Actually, well, it doesn't really refer to that, but it mostly refers to being whole in our lives. In Philippians 3:12, it tells us, "Not that I have already obtained all of this, or have I already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that from which Yeshua the Messiah took hold of me." The second thing that we can see within these verses is that because of the defects that these people would have or could have, they were not allowed to work inside or outside the Mishkan without approaching the altar of sacrifices or the holy place behind the veil, where the table of bread was located, where the altar of incense and the lampstand was. And this was because he was prevented from offering the bread of the Creator, but not only from eating it, since the sustenance of the Levites came from the offerings that the people of Israel would offer to the Eternal. Continue with chapters 1-7 of chapter 22, we can read about the holy things. This refers to everything that was inside and outside the Mishkan that had to be anointed and consecrated to the Eternal. But it also refers to the sacrifices where the blood was poured out on the altar of sacrifice. And we also could once again being mentioned the sustenance of the Levites, which came from the offerings of the people. That food was not just anything because it was also consecrated to the Creator, but not only what they consumed had to be holy, but also purity had to be in the person who consumed these foods. Therefore, eating these holy things with some filth was profaning the name of the Creator. If they had any sort of type of filth that had to be purified, or that they had to purify themselves by washing with water and waiting for the new renewal of a new day to be able to approach eating the holy things correctly. Otherwise, if they didn't do all of this, then the consequences that they would have was to be cut off from the presence of the Creator. From this, we can learn that in the same way, there should not be any filth in us to participate with our acts. Let us remember that food comes from the Messiah and his sacrifice in our lives. That is why it is important to carry it out cleanly in our service to the Creator, therefore through the water of his word. Otherwise, we will be cut off from his presence. Perhaps not in a literal way or in a physical way, but more in a spiritual sense that applies to our soul. Continuing with verses 8-9, it says, "He shall not eat what dies of itself or is torn by beast, and so make himself unclean by it. I am the Eternal. They shall therefore keep my charge, lest they bear sin for it and die thereby when they profane it. I am the Eternal who sanctifies them. In these verses, we can read that in addition to adding one more instruction on contamination by consuming animals that died of unknown causes or because they were torn into pieces by some sort of wild beast, it also mentions the importance of keeping the ordinances so that they do not die from desecrating due to the contamination. In the same way, this also applies today, not in a literal or not literally as within its context, but more in a spiritual way. And in addition to the fact that each instruction has an effect on in our life. Continuing with verses 10 to 16, it says, a lay person shall not eat of a holy thing. No foreign guest of the priest or hired worker shall eat of a holy thing. But if a priest buys a slave as his property for money, the slave may eat of it, and anyone born in his house may eat from his food. If a priest's daughter marries a layman, she shall not eat of the contribution of the holy things. But if a priest's daughter is widowed or divorced or has no child and returns to the father's house as in her youth, she may eat of her father's food, yet no lay person shall eat of it. And if anyone eats of a holy thing unintentionally, they shall add the fifth of its value to it and give the holy thing to the priest. And they shall not profane the holy things of the people of Israel, which they contribute to the Eternal, and so them to bear iniquity and guilt by eating their holy things. For I am the Eternal who sanctifies them. In those verses, we can read that it describes who could eat the holy thing, who could eat of the holy things and who could not, referring to the sacrifices where the blood was spilled on the altar. Let's remember that from these sacrifices, these were reserved for the sustenance of the ministers and their families, as we can read in these verses. The first person that is mentioned that was not allowed to eat from these holy things were the foreigners. This refers to a person who, despite not being originally from the Israelite people, was not part of, and who was also not part of the tribe of Levi, and for that reason, it is why that person wasn't allowed to eat from that food. But at the same time, it also mentions of a person, once again, that was not or that did not belong in the tribe of the Levites. Then that person could only consume the holy things for two reasons. One of them was because he was bought by the minister. That was bought by the minister with money. And in this way, this foreigner was considered part of that family, and he was now able to eat from the holy things. Another reason why he was also allowed to eat from the holy things was if a minister's daughter, or talking more about the daughter, if the minister's daughter married a stranger who did not belong to the tribe of the Levites, then her daughter was not allowed to eat of the holy things unless she was a widowed person or a divorced person, but without any child, and she had to go back to her parents or to her father's house. That's what we can read in these verses. And finally, it also mentions that by mistake, if anyone consumes from these holy things, any of these foods, then they only had to restore and add a fifth to the minister to avoid misusing those holy things. From verses 17 to 25, we can read that these laws apply to anyone who offered a korban, not only for the people of Israel, but also for the foreigner who had converted. The ministers had to be aware that these laws were applied in the necessary offerings as well as the voluntary ones. Because let us remember that any animal that was presented to the Creator had to be without defect. Although some defects, such as the fact that the animal had more or less weight, was acceptable as a voluntary offering, because it was not made as an anointment for sin, since the perfection of the animal was necessary to cover it. All these requirements for the korbanot pointed to the perfect sacrifice of the Messiah, who is the means by which we can approach the Creator and through him present ourselves in the same way to the Father. In Romans 12 verses 1 to 2, it tells us, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of Elohim's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to the Eternal. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what the Eternal will in his good, pleasing, and perfect will." From verses 26 to 30, we can see instructions that correspond to the sacrifices. One of these instructions is that the animal that was presented should not be too small, as it represented cruelty to the newborn. Probably this was something normal that in the other nations would practice in honor of their deities, but the Creator ordered that the cow should be at least 7 days under the care of its mother, and once that time had elapsed from the 8th day, then it could be presented as an offering to the Creator. On the other hand, offering the mother and the child on the same day was also not allowed, because according to some positions, they allude to the fact that it had to do with some Canaanite fertility ritual. When someone presented a sacrifice to the Eternal, that person had to offer it according to what was established by the Eternal for it to be accepted by him. Lastly, in these verses, we also see that the rest of the offering had to be consumed that same day and divided between them, and the offering also had to be divided between the minister and the one who was offering it. In this, it teaches us that when we participate in the sacrifice of the Messiah, it has to be in its time and form, not in our way or the time that we want or we think is correct, but according to what the Eternal has established in his word. Continue with the last verses of chapter 22, verses 31 to 33 say, "So you shall keep my commandments and do them. I am the Eternal, and you shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Eternal who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your Elohim. I am the Almighty." Lastly, in these verses, we can see that it speaks about keeping the commandments. Or the Eternal tells the people of Israel the importance of keeping the commandments so as not to profane the name of the Creator, because through obedience to them, the Eternal was sanctified. And also, finally, the Eternal reminds the people of Israel that He was the one who brought them out of Egypt. In conclusion of all of these two chapters that we have analyzed, we have learned that throughout these laws, we find principles of order and holiness that must be presented in each area of each person's life and their service before the Creator. Now, through Yeshua, we are called to that as ministers of the body of the Messiah. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time. If you like this video, you could give us a thumbs up. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions of new themes you would like us to talk about, you could leave it down in the comment section down below. Once again, thank you for your time and have a good one.